Welcome to Podland, the last word in podcasting news. Pinch Punch, it's the first of the month. It's the 1st of September 2022, the start of International Podcast Month, apparently. I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the MD of River Radio, the podcast first radio station.
He is. Podland is sponsored by Squadcast, the remote recording tool that creators love. Squadcast has just launched version 5 with new features and a new look. 4,000 hours of high-quality audio is remotely recorded every week using Squadcast.
And we're sponsored by Buzzsprout, podcast hosting made easy. Last week, 3,216 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout. And now there's Buzzsprout ads to grow your podcast wherever it's hosted.
Indeed. Podland is where Sam and I review the week's top podcasting stories covered on Pod News. Last week I was at Dallas at Podcast Movement, while Sam was in a hot tub in Cornwall.
I was indeed, sipping some nice fizzy bubbly stuff. Now, a quick reminder, Podland can sometimes be quite long, but we support both transcripts and chapters. This allows you to jump to the part of this podcast that interests you the most. If your podcast app doesn't support transcripts and chapters, then grab a new one from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Indeed. So I had great fun in Dallas last week at Podcast Movement, Sam, and your presence was missed.
Thank you very much. Yes, I felt very warmed by the fact that there was a picture of me and you on the stage. So tell me, James, because I have massive FOMO from not being there. So many people I wanted to meet, Adam and Dave being top of my list. What was Podcast Movement like? What was Adam Curry's and Dave's presentation like, and what was the big takeaway, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, Podcast Movement was massive, as it usually is. And this time, there was a whole Sounds Profitable day before the main conference, which was fun. Lots of excitement, lots of drama, which I'm not going to go into. But also Adam Curry, the podfather, of course, speaking with Dave Jones at Podcast Movement. I hear in the Podcasting 2.0 podcast, I hear that this was the 4th time that they have ever actually met in person. I always thought they went together like peas in a pod, but they do, but only on a virtual way. But it was a super good presentation. Dave was excellent. He talked exactly to time. What a professional. And Adam explained the history of open podcasting. Dave went through every single feature available in the new podcast namespace. Did a really good job at that, but also both Dave and Adam had lots of meetings with lots of people, and I think really moved forward the use of the new podcast namespace and the index. So great to see them both in the flesh, so to speak, at the event.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit more. I mean, Edison Research had a big reveal. The new report came out from them.
Yeah, so Edison Research shared some more data from their research that they come out with. Gabriel Soto doing a fantastic job, and it was good to see Gabriel there. I believe that there's going to be a webinar version of that in the next week or so. So those of us who didn't see it, because I was in meetings, those of us who didn't see Gabriel's...
That's what you call it now.
Yeah, no, genuinely was a meeting. So those of us who didn't see Gabriel speaking will be able to see his thing as a webinar later on. Sounds Profitable is also now available as a webinar on the Sounds Profitable website, soundsprofitable.com. There was also the launch of a brand new thing, which I'm involved with as an advisor. It's called the Podcast Broker, and it's a really smart tool that basically allows you, if you get bored with your podcast, maybe you've grown it to a point where you don't think you can grow it any further, maybe you've said all that you can say about a particular subject, you can sell that podcast just like you can sell any other business. It's a product called the Podcast Broker, which is the brainchild of Heather Osgood, who's also True Native Media's founder. And it's pretty cool. So hopefully we'll get Heather on a future podcast here.
James, YouTube and Twitter launched their podcasting offerings. Let's start off with YouTube. So yes. I know you had the big exclusive back in March, but they've launched a page, fundamentally, from what I can see. What's been the feedback? What's your thoughts on YouTube's new podcast announcement?
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird thing that they've launched, basically. They've rolled out something called youtube.com/podcasts, which you can or can't see in the US, depending on what your account is set to randomly. It's a page which contains what YouTube thinks are podcasts, popular episodes, playlists, recommendations. There seems to be no way of adding podcasts into there. There's no functionality around RSS. There's none of that. I asked, well, how do you appear as a podcast in there? And the new PR person that I've found at YouTube basically said, it's all pretty editorially focused with a little bit of algorithms in there as well. I was hoping to be wowed by YouTube's podcasting launch. It's certainly lacking quite a lot of whelm. I'm most certainly underwhelmed at the launch, but it's a good start. It's only available in the US, which is one of the brain dead things that American companies do. So that's a little bit of a frustration, but it's a good start at least. Kai Chuck was speaking at Podcast Movement and said, not frankly very much other than the fact that they will continue to iterate on the current page. They plan to launch new features to enhance the podcast listening experience a little bit later, but that's sort of basically where they've got to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I put on a VPN and went and had a look at it, and then I took the VPN off straight away. There wasn't very much in there. We do have a YouTube page. I mean, I think we've got 20 or so episodes now on our YouTube page. We use Headliner to automatically post to it. I did look at some of the other people's reactions to it. Annalise Nielsen from Pacific Continent sent, everyone is concerned about what to do with podcasts on YouTube, but no one seemed 100% sure on the answer yet, which is pretty much where I think he was saying. I did look at B. Andrew Scott. He's put up a YouTube podcast about it. I think his opening line was, after about a few minutes of explaining, was it's destined to die and be forgotten, which was pretty accurate, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you only launch something that works in the US and only works for some people, Facebook's done that with Facebook podcasts. It was a complete failure because, amazingly, podcasts are global in nature. So you might not want to, launch signposts within the app to the podcast page, but make sure that the podcast page works to everybody across the world, because otherwise that's a complete waste of time. So I think that's a bit of a misstep. Interesting to see NPR adding more than 20 of their biggest shows onto YouTube. It's clearly something that YouTube and NPR have been hatching, because that came out basically a day after the YouTube podcasts section, which YouTube haven't officially launched. It just has suddenly sort of appeared. Interesting to see, NPR launching that. But, as I say, it's something which is not a fantastic initial launch. It seems not only minimum viable product, it seems that there's virtually no product there at all.
Yeah, but you did have an exclusive on Pod News from a company called Studio 71, which said they were releasing more than 100 shows on YouTube, and that had led to the company doubling its podcast audience in 2022.
It's a great place for podcasts to promote themselves. I've lost count of the amount of times that I have been in YouTube, using YouTube to see Pod News being recommended to me. But that doesn't escape from the fact that Pod News' episodes there get about 30 plays. So, not massive. But it's certainly a place to market your shows, and Studio 71 have basically said that by simultaneously releasing their shows on YouTube, that has essentially doubled their podcast audience, not their YouTube audience, but their podcast audience. I think underlines the fact that it's a good place to market yourself, but that's probably as far as it goes.
Yeah, B. Andrew, in his video, and I will put a link in our show notes, said, the positive side of the YouTube was, better discoverability, good community. And again, it goes back to comments being one of the YouTube strengths. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on with the podcast index community to put cross comments in, but we're not quite there yet. So yeah, I think, it's the thing that Kai Chuck said was the big thing at the podcast movement in LA. We have comments in YouTube. So I guess the community now needs to remove that one single, benefit advantage that YouTube seems to feel it has. And then what's the benefit of YouTube beyond that then, I guess?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, apart from being the second largest search engine in the world, which I guess is one thing, I find it interesting. There was a new podcast launched yesterday called My Duvet Flip, which is being released on TikTok and on YouTube only. So they're not releasing it on any of the existing podcast platforms. They're just simply releasing it on TikTok and YouTube, which is, it's a strategy. Not entirely convinced about it, but still, there we go.
Yeah, I think the next one, though, is going to be another interesting platform that announced as well. I think you were having a beer at the time. Podcasts are coming to Twitter was announced last Thursday. So come on, tell me, what are your thoughts now on Twitter getting into the podcast game?
Yes, well, it's a very peculiar integration. So shows are appearing in the new Spaces tab, which has a picture of a microphone and that sort of thing. But it's not really a podcast app in that you can't choose individual shows. You can't even share. It does use RSS, apparently, but it's curated from what people you follow listen to and what people you follow share, and basically gives pre-selected shows in topic-based playlists. And there's no ability to add your own RSS feed. So again, I've got no idea how to get this show on there. And again, it's only available to people around the world who use English as their interface language, and it's only available to random people. So it's not available to me, for example, in either of my two main Twitter accounts. So so I can't actually see it. But Miss Eileen Smith, has shared a good video of how the thing works. And the types of shows on there. But, I'm not entirely convinced that there's a plan for basically giving people a bunch of different shows and saying, you might be interested in those. But again, it might be good marketing for individual shows. Who knows?
If you were a betting man, James, what would you say? Do you think this will go the same way, i.e. YouTube and Twitter, as Facebook? Or do you think they will enhance it and add features that make it much more attainable for most podcast users?
If you look at them separately, so Twitter is not trying to be a podcast app. It's trying to add additional audio into its app that people might find interesting. So from that point of view, I think it's absolutely fine. It's not going to change anything much. But I think that's an absolutely fine thing for Twitter to end up doing, and who cares if that wins or loses, if that fails or not, it'll still be there. The YouTube thing, I found it interesting when I was chatting to Google in the beginning of this year. They were basically telling me, you're not going to see very many changes to the Google Podcasts app this year. They said that they're focusing more on search, and that's all absolutely fine, because that's the department that puts the Google Podcasts app together. If the plan is to replace Google Podcasts with YouTube, which may or may not be a plan, then that's something to sort of really think about in terms of what the benefit of that is going to be. And I'm not entirely convinced that the YouTube experience as it currently is going to be a particularly exciting one.
Yeah, there was a song, You're Everywhere and Nowhere Baby, and that's what I feel right now, that you feel you have to be. I mean, looking at it, you've got, the traditional platforms, Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else, all the directories, and now we're adding YouTube, Twitter, and it seems even Substack's getting into the game as well of podcasting. Do you think, as a podcaster, if you were having to market your own platform and podcast, which we do as well, should you be spread so widely? Should you be everywhere? Or would you say focus back on one or two places only?
I mean, I think, being everywhere makes sense if you can be everywhere cheaply without much additional hard work. And I think that's the thing here, making sure that making sure that you can be in all of these platforms, but making sure that you're not spending an awful lot of time doing so. I wouldn't be on YouTube for the Pod News podcast if I had to spend any time doing it. It's just a script that produces a video version on my computer, and it's a bit of Zapier that gets the podcast up there. And I'm very happy with that, and that's a cool thing. If I had to sit and upload that podcast every single day onto YouTube manually, that would be an utter waste of my time, given the amount of people that actually use it. But I think it's worthwhile going there. And let's not forget, YouTube is massive. YouTube is already selling audio-only ads in quite a few parts of the world. YouTube has a mechanism by which it can pay creators in virtually every country in the world. And YouTube has, automated systems that will sell pre-rolls, post-rolls, mid-rolls into your video, certainly. And so there's no reason why it couldn't be into your audio as well. All of that means that YouTube might be an amazing place to earn money from your content in the future, and might be a fantastic podcast platform. But I think it's rather too early to tell. And while they're being, so myopic to only launch it in the US and only to certain people in the US, then I don't think it's going to move the needle at all.
Now, talking of earning money, Chris Messina, a friend of the show, captured a post that shows that Spotify has turned on the live experience for ads. James, tell me more about this.
Yeah, so this is a very neat thing, and it occurs to me that this is possibly something that we should be submitting as a pimp, as a new podcast namespace idea. The idea is, as you listen to a podcast and it serves up some ads in the podcast, then you can actually see that company's logo, you can see a call to action within the podcast app. And we shouldn't probably forget that most people are listening to podcasts with their phones in their pocket. They're not looking at their phones. So what the benefit here is that you grab your phone out of your pocket once you've finished listening to a podcast, and on the screen there are all of the calls to action for all of the advertising that you've heard through that show. And you can see that there's quite a lot of benefit there. It would be quite nice, I think, to think about something similar for podcasting 2.0 apps that might be able to show the sponsors or any other calls to action in a really clear manner within the user interface. And that's not necessarily chapters. I think that's something a little bit different. But maybe that's something worthwhile having a look at, so that they actually appear, directly in the UI.
How do you submit your podcast then to have this feature turned on? Because it feels that only a few podcasts have been given the privilege.
So I think, and alongside that and these transcripts that seem to have appeared in Spotify for certain shows, I think it is a Spotify original thing only. So if you are not using RSS, you're publishing through Spotify's own, model, and you are a Spotify show, then that's how you get the sponsored tags in, that's how you get a transcript tag in, and various other things. I don't think it's available for the likes of you and I, because Spotify don't play nicely with RSS.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that the eagle-eyed amongst us had noticed was Spotify now claim there's 5,290,396 podcasts in their index. That seems a lot more than everyone else's.
Indeed, 5.2 million or 5.3 million if we're going to be strictly accurate there. Yes, they will certainly have an awful lot of crap in there, as well as some of the good ones. But that is an awful lot of podcasts. Just to compare that, Podcast Index at the moment is quoting 4.1 million as the total amount of podcasts in their index. Of course, Podcast Index does get rid of some crap abandoned shows through an algorithm that they have published. So you can probably surmise from that Spotify aren't. Apple are listing 2.4 million. So, again, a significantly smaller amount. But given that currently, at least, you have to pass a human approval process to get into Apple Podcasts, one would assume that has weeded out quite a lot of the crap in there.
For now, James, for now, because one of the other things that Apple announced was a number of changes to the platform's RSS requirements in 2023. One of the big things, of course, was no more email addresses in RSS feeds. But the other thing was the way that you submit your podcast is going to be easier.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good move. You will submit your podcast. It will automatically and instantly get into Apple Podcasts, but it won't appear in search or recommendations until it has been approved. So basically, you appear instantly. You can start sharing that link. You can use the Apple Podcasts marketing tools to share the fact that you're on Apple Podcasts and all of that. But it won't appear in search, in recommendations, and presumably in the API until it's been manually approved by the Apple Podcasts folk. And I think that's a really neat plan that basically gets rid of one of the problems that Apple Podcasts tool has given us, which is that you're never quite sure when your podcast is going to be available in Apple Podcasts. The quick answer is you'll be available instantly. You just might not be able to be searched for quite instantly. But I think that makes an awful lot of sense, as does getting rid of email addresses from RSS feeds. And in fact, I've already pulled out the email address from the Podclock podcast that I do, which is an automated podcast, which is a feed checker. And I'm looking forward to seeing whether the absence of those tags is going to break anything anywhere. My suspicion is it probably won't. But my understanding is that Apple Podcasts, even now, don't actually need an email address in the RSS feed. So, I think that's a great move.
So does that mean the verify tag that was being discussed a few weeks back in the namespace is needed, or should that still go ahead?
I mean, it's needed for other people that want to verify that a person specifically owns a podcast. Apple is hoping that the only people who submit a show into Apple Podcasts are those people that actually own the podcast anyway. And that may or may not be the case. But that's what Apple is rather hoping. Of course, you still need to sign up for an Apple ID, an iCloud account and all of that kind of malarkey in order to actually get something into the Apple Podcasts app. So I think from that point of view, that's going to be easy. But yeah, if you are wanting to claim your show in Podchaser or in, others of these services, then there might not be an email address in there anymore. Those websites and those services would be, you would imagine, scrambling around trying to work out how they're going to accept podcast claims in the future once Apple does get rid of the email addresses there, and that's where a podcast verify tag might work. But again, you could just hide behind terms and conditions saying you can only submit your own stuff.
Now, one of the other changes, and something I'm not quite sure about, so I'd have wanted to ask you, they're going to support something called an e-tag. What's an e-tag, James?
So an e-tag is a really easy way just to check that an RSS feed has been updated. There are two ways of checking whether or not something has been updated when you go and have a look at it on the internet. One way is to check when it was last updated, and there's an HTTP header for that. But that's not always correct. That's not always actually showing you when the last piece of information was put into that particular RSS feed. And so what an e-tag is it's just a bit of random text, which if it changes, you know that the content of that feed has changed. And there are lots of things that support that. There are lots of podcast apps that already support that. And what it basically means is you can just ask for the HTTP headers. You don't need to ask for the full RSS feed. That will dramatically reduce the amount of bandwidth that people are using, and everybody should be supporting e-tag as of now, but everybody isn't, and it's great to see that Apple will be supporting that in the near future. I think that's a good move from them as well.
So no chance of them supporting something like Podping, though?
I think Podping is a little bit different, and I'm sure that there would be a chance of them supporting Podping, as we move forward. I think currently, though, supporting e-tag is a good halfway house of essentially Apple not having to pull down a full RSS feed every single time it's checking, just checking the e-tag at the beginning and going, okay, well, I don't need to download that, is a good plan. So that doesn't stop them from asking, stop them from looking at Podping in the future, but it does mean that they are making their systems much less bandwidth heavy, which is a good thing for everybody.
Now, moving on, Alby, which is the micropayments wallet that's been used by you and I and many other people, has unveiled an API. The product is a simple-to-use Bitcoin wallet and a browser extension. Have you had a chance to look at the API? I don't know when you'd have a chance, by the way, with the insomnia that you had in Dallas, the flying that you've been doing. But I'll ask anyway, have you had a chance to look at the API, James?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to have a look at the API yet, but what I have been working on is supporting WebLN, which is essentially the standard that Alby supports, as well as other similar Bitcoin wallets, to enable boostergrams directly from Podnews podcast pages. So that's certainly something that I have been looking into. In fact, if you view the console on some of the latest podcast pages, then you'll see a little note if you are using Alby, but I haven't added anything more in there. But yeah, Alby is part of this WebLN specification, and in the end, I would like to see if you've got Alby installed, then I can give you additional features to help support creators, and I think that would be a good plan. Alby's also unveiled a partnership with Podverse, which is a very excellent podcast app, and that will allow listeners to use their Alby wallet to send boosts directly to podcasts, which is very neat. They're supporting boosts from the get-go. They're not supporting streaming sats yet, but they will doubtless be supporting streaming sats at some point in the future. But good to see a little bit of movement there.
Yeah, I mean, I caught up with the guys at Alby this week, and hopefully next week we'll have a little announcement from them. But I also used the Podverse client to integrate with my Alby wallet. It's very nice that now I have a wallet that I can send and receive sats as a creator, but also I have an app that I can actually use the same wallet for as well. Now, moving on, a third-party app called Podify has appeared on Android. Yes. So I've never seen it, but it's meant to help you use Spotify with better playback. Have you tried it?
Yeah, it's a weird old thing. I have tried it, but it's not great for me. It's basically a better podcast app, but uses Spotify as a player. So if you want a decent podcast app experience, but you want to listen to Joe Rogan, then with Podify you can use it. You end up logging in through your Spotify account, and you also need the Spotify app on your phone as well, and it talks to the Spotify app. in your phone, but basically gives you a different interface. I thought it was interesting. I'm not entirely and legal, but I'm not entirely convinced as to what user user need it's there to actually fix. My suspicion is it's not fixing an awful lot, but quite fun to end up seeing that using the API. So that was pretty cool.
Now, moving on totally away from the podcast apps, Zencastr has launched what they call the first end-to-end video podcast platform. The service now records 4K video and allows you to edit it, host and distribute it to major platforms including Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts. Now, we're supported by Squadcast, but again, have you had a little shifty around Zencastr's new platform?
Yeah, this was a bit of a confusing press release because what Zencastr is basically doing, by the sounds of things, is hosting podcasts and hosting both video and audio podcasts. It talks about distributing your video podcast to Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts. Let's be clear, they won't do that. They can't get your video podcast that you record with Zencastr into Spotify, because the only people who can do that are Anchor. And they won't get your video podcast into Google Podcasts because Google doesn't support video podcasts at all. So what that line actually meant was that the audio podcasts that you might host with Zencastr can get into both Spotify and Google Podcasts. It's all a bit of a confusing press release, but nice to see additional competition in this space. Squadcast is a very good tool that we use every week. There's Riverside, of course, which is an excellent tool too, which is also doing video, and Zencastr adding video in there as well. I think does show that YouTube is going to be a thing, and at some point more people will be making their shows in video. So I'm sure that's what their plan is in the future.
But yeah, I've never used Zencastr, so I couldn't tell you whether it was good, bad or indifferent, really.
No, the only thing that I can tell you about Zencastr is that they had some very nice T-shirts at Podcast Movement, and I grabbed one of those. But obviously I'm not wearing it today. In fact, I'm wearing a Stitcher T-shirt today because I'm testing out all of the T-shirt swag that I picked up, and why ever not. And the folk from CleanFeed were also at Podcast Movement as well, chatting to Adam, who uses CleanFeed. In fact, I notice I'm on the Media podcast on Friday in the UK, and they use CleanFeed too now. They used to use Zoom, so I'm glad that they've moved on to a decent platform. So good to end up seeing those folk as well.
Yeah, talking of Zoom, it seems in the US, there was a report you highlighted. Most podcast producers use Zoom for guest interviews. According to new research from Interview Valley, it announced at Podcast Movement that 74% of guest interviews had a video component and 5% of the shows charged the guest to appear, which is really weird.
Yeah, isn't it?
But a high percentage there using Zoom. Is that just people going, what's the easiest, quickest way to create a podcast and going Zoom rather than looking at these other platforms?
Yeah, I think it's that everybody understands how to use Zoom because of the pandemic. And so therefore it's easier to ask potential guests, we'll just chat on Zoom. I think it would be better if they were to use, a proper recording tool like Squadcast, particularly because, Squadcast sits there and records at both ends. So, as we've been chatting today, the internet has sort of frozen a little bit, and sometimes I've missed the occasional word that you've ended up saying, but this recording, of course, has none of that because it's recorded at your end as well as at my end. That's the benefit of these tools, and that's something that Zoom doesn't do. So, I suspect that it's just quite a lot of podcasters are either lazy or they are concerned about getting their users to jump through too many hoops, the people that they're interviewing to jump too many hoops, and and maybe it's just easier for them just to use that sort of thing.
Moving on, James, let's have a look around Podland, what's going on. Closer to your home, Australia, it seems congratulations to Corey Layton. What's he done?
Yes, he has won the Radio Today Executive Leader of the Year. He is the head of digital audio ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia. He's a very nice man, and many congratulations to him there. In Germany, a bunch of things going on. Audi has purchased AudioMe, which is a Austrian company which focuses on podcast advertising to German countries. Also, Libsyn purchased a German podcast company last week, Julep Podcasting. So there's clearly stuff going on in Germany as well.
Podimo in Finland has launched a subscription podcast and audiobook platform. Now, Podimo is a really interesting company for me because it doesn't really hit my radar, but they raised a ton of money a year ago, 70 million, I remember. It launches with a number of exclusive shows in Finland and will translate others to Finnish. 15% of Finns are already paying for podcasts.
Yes, and I can also tell you it is officially Podimo and not Podimo, which I may have called it in the past. It's Podimo, I asked. To the UK, and Audio Boom debuted a new slate of original podcasts there, but also a very, very big launch this week. The News Agents, which is a new daily news podcast from Global. Matt Deegan, friend of the show, estimates that more than £1 million has been spent on launching that particular show. They're getting new studios and everything, apparently, which is all very nice. And typical BBC, they chose the launch date of The News Agents, which is hosted by Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, to announce the replacement for Emily Maitlis and John Sopel on the Americast. There they are, competing with the commercial broadcasters like they say that they never do. The show will be hosted now by Justin Webb, Sarah Smith, Mariana Spring, and The Zurch, whatever that is. So that should be fun.
Yeah, on next week's show, I'm excited that we'll be having Dino Sophos, James, to come and tell us all about the News Agents.
Yes. And he's the man behind the News Agents, works for Persephonica, and he's a bright man. I've been reading the reviews of the first episode of the News Agents, and the reviews are not entirely positive, but they're again not entirely positive, possibly because the newspapers who have printed the reviews obviously have their own podcasts, and they are loath to give Global any benefit there. But one person calls it a slick, expensive mess. And one person says, I would have switched off after 11 minutes had I not been contractually obliged to listen. Ouch. That said, I've listened to the first two and they're pretty good. So congratulations to Global for doing something that's pretty cool there.
Yeah, they're aiming to get 100,000 UK listeners every day.
Yes, so good luck with that. I would have thought that they should be able to manage that pretty easily, so that's a smart thing. To Asia, where I will be next week, Acast has announced a new schedule for its popular A-Class digital event program, and they are focusing on Asian voices in this month's session. I think Asian voices from the UK in this particular case, but anyway, you can find more information obviously on the Acast website. Celebrating Asian Voices is their first event, and there's Radio Days Asia, which I will be at on Tuesday and Wednesday. That's in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and looking forward to taking part in that, and lots of really good Asian podcasters will be there. So more news on that on Thursday's Podland.
Now over to Africa. Podcasting in Africa is on the rise. Why is it not profitable yet is a story that's in Tech Cabal. It looks at the podcast industry throughout Africa, so I'll certainly put a show note link to that. Did you have any more to say on that report, James?
Yes, a lot of the conversation is around, data costs and that sort of thing, but also just, it's still a very young market there. So interesting to see a little bit of growth going on in Africa. And in the US, Libsyn have launched a new programmatic ad solution for Libsyn-hosted shows, hot on the heels of Blueberry, who did so last week. So that's now an awful lot of additional inventory, which will be available available for people wanting to advertise programmatically into podcasts. So it'll be interesting to find out how much of that is filled. And Odyssey is now using Sounder as the company's brand safety partner. They're joining Spoken Layer, iHeartRadio, and DAX.
Now, we don't normally do the charts. I know on Pod News, James, you have the charts every week, the Spotify and Apple number one listed.
Yeah.
And sadly, it doesn't change much on the Spotify account. Normally it says Joe Rogan, and that's it, really. But there's a new entry at number one in the Spotify charts. Who's taken the spot?
Yes, there is a new entry. It's Archetypes with Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. And the first couple of episodes are already available. It's produced by Gimlet. I have been wading through so many hot takes on this podcast. It's ridiculous. Not covered any of them. But interesting to see that Archetypes has finally pushed Joe Rogan off the top for at least a little bit. Mariah Carey is on episode 2, and I can't remember who was on episode 1. Have you listened to it?
Yeah, it was Serena Williams, and look, I just came off the back of watching Will Smith's film portraying Serena Williams' father. Richard the King. Look, I was coming back from Cornwall, sat in the car with my wife. We thought, great, look, let's stick it on, let's give it a go.
Great.
I know Rebecca Sanalis, who's the producer, so I wanted to see how it'd gone down. It's slick. The first opening 10-15 minutes is very slick. It's very well produced.
And also going on in the charts, there's been a new people chart. Inside Radio has published its annual list of the most powerful people in podcasting. Now, I have taken the mick out of this chart in previous years because Inside Radio is not very good at mentioning that it is owned by iHeartRadio. And not only is it owned by iHeartRadio, but every single year for the last 5 years, weirdly, iHeart's Conal Byrne has been number one of the most powerful people in podcasting. And I'm sure that Conal really is a very powerful person in podcasting, but I'm not necessarily sure that he's always going to be number one in there. Anyway, what they've done is instead of making this a top 10, they have now made it 50, and they have now very cleverly put it into alphabetical order. So it's just literally a list of people. That's a bright move and a clever move, and I support it. So thank you, Inside Radio, for doing that. I mean, if only you'd just mentioned the fact that you're owned by iHeartRadio, that would be probably a good move too.
And added you to the list would have been good as well.
Well, you weren't there either, Sam, so,
No,
what
I'm
can I
never going
say?
to be there. I'm never looking on that list going, why am I not there? Never a thought.
And frankly, I'm never going to be there too, and I should obviously point out that they are competition to me. But I can also see that there's credit where credit's due, and it's pretty good to see that they've been a little bit more transparent in the way that they put that list together. There's another chart as well out there, Fountain, which has launched its own podcast chart. Now, I normally am not a particular fan of podcast charts, but Pod News is number 48, and therefore I think that this chart is excellent. So congratulations, Fountain. What's interesting is it's a list of shows where it shows you the most supported podcasts by Boostergram, the most supported episodes, and the baller boosts. So you can see what type of amount people are actually boosting. It's a nice plan. So it's a clever system from Fountain. So it's good to see it.
Yeah, no, they're using good gamification there to create a leaderboard. Well done. Nice job.
Yes, and talking about boosts, it's time for...
Now it's time for the Boostergram Corner.
Boostergram Corner. I don't know a thing about crypto.
Boostergram Corner, it is indeed. And lots of boosts over the last couple of weeks. As you noticed, last week was a special from the floor of Dallas, so therefore no Boostergrams in there. But thank you to the many people who have sent us boosts, including Sitch Radio, who sent us 1,000 sats from Fountain. Much love from Sitch Radio and Growth Network podcasts and our collaborative show at feedops.com, which has got 2 Ds, which is very confusing. Feedops.com, maybe. But Sitch Radio, thank you for that. That's very kind.
Yeah, we got 5,000 sats from Dave Jones saying, James, it was great seeing you and getting to spend a little bit of time together this week. Sam, hope we get the same chance in the not too distant future. Indeed, Dave, I would look forward to sitting down with you and I having a red glass of red wine and you probably having a beer. But it would be lovely to chew the cud, as they say.
Yes, it was really good to see Dave. I didn't speak to him for very long. I didn't speak to Adam for very long, but it was really good to see both of those. And they even turned up to the piss up in a brewery that I organised, which was pretty good. So that was nice. And talking about Adam, 25,000 sats. That's our big baller of the week. I've asked whether the big baller jingle can be added into the list on the GitHub, and I think that's fallen on deaf ears. But I'll ask again. Can we have the big baller jingle, please? I'd like to use that. Thanks. Anyway, Adam says thank you for releasing early, which I guess I kind of did on Thursday last week. Great for the ride home, indeed. And I very much enjoyed the Podcasting 2.0 podcast last week, which I listened to on the walk to a party at Podcast Movement. And it was essentially Adam and Dave doing what they always do, which is recording remotely. So Adam was on the 26th floor and Dave was on the 23rd floor. They were just recording their show as they ordinarily do. Dave did notice something, which I'm glad that he noticed. He noticed that in the hotel, the stuff in the shower gel bottle was exactly the same as the stuff in the shampoo bottle. I completely agree with that, Dave. Thank you for making that very important journalistic point. So thank you for that, and thank you both for your sats. I appreciate it. Moritz from Albi has sent us 2,110 sats. That's a thing, isn't it, that number? I can't remember what it is. But anyway, via the podcastindex.org website, can we help with the podcast value tag page on podcastnamespace.org? Yes, you can. Just go and submit a pull request. That would be lovely. Thank you, Moritz. That would be a good thing.
And we've also had the 888 podcast sats from Old Podcast. James is going to bankrupt me if he does impressions every week. Go on, James.
Yeah. Yes, of these impressions that I do of Todd Cochran, getyourOwn.com. I discover, by the way, that if you are a host with Blueberry and you spend more than $20 a month, then you get yourown.com, which is a very clever plan. And yes, and of Rob Greenlee. That's right, Todd. Justin from the Optimal Living Daily Podcast Network. I met the folks from the Optimal Living Daily Podcast. They bought me a beer as well, which was very kind. So thank you to them, and thank you also to Bisaya Podcast. Fun conversations, always love it. 50 sats from Fountain, that's all very kind. And if you do get value from this podcast, then please do consider dropping us a message and a boost. Use Fountain if you like, or use something else if you like that better as well. We would love to get your messages, and that's always a good thing.
And thank you to Kyron from Mere Mortals for reviewing us this week, James. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that podcast.
He did. I haven't had a chance to listen to it. It's called Value for Value. It's a great podcast. It's worthwhile having a listen to. And what I like about that is that he's cut us into the splits for this week, so we do actually get to see some of his mentions as well. It's a really good thing. So thank you, Karin, for doing that. Let's move over to Event Corner, shall we? Because there's lots coming up. Let me firstly tell you about Podcast Day 24, which is an excellent thing, which I may be organising in Australia, October the 4th. If you are a fan of podcasting, you really should be coming to Podcast Day 24, which is in Sydney on October the 4th. It's for 8 hours, and there's lots of people speaking there. Not quite sure who I've announced so far and who I haven't, but you'll find more information at podcastday24.com, as well as the day in London and the day in New York as well. I think behind the New York event is Steve Pratt, ex of Pacific Content, of course, as well. And behind the London event is Matt Deegan from Folder Media and Peter Nigel from Radio Days Europe. So it's a great event. If you go and see one of them face-to-face, then you also get to see the other two on demand as well. So it's well worth going to.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be going to that, I hope. Tickets are available now, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well.
Indeed. There's also the Publisher Podcast Summit in London on October the 5th. You'll find a coupon code in the show notes to save you money for that. There's also a bunch of other things going on, including the Afros and Audio Podcast Festival, which is happening in Philadelphia in the end of October. She Podcasts and Podbean doing a live panel that everybody can watch on September the 9th. Audio UK doing their Audio Production Awards, which is a big thing in the UK. The Irish Podcast Awards, of course, happening in Dublin on the 16th of September. And Podcast Futures, Quarter 4 2022, which is happening in Quarter 3 in New York City at the Javits Centre, which Podcast Radio is running, and it's alongside the NAB show, which is also happening at about that sort of time.
Yeah, so if you want to find any more about these events, go over to podevents.net and you'll have all the links there as well.
Indeed. So, what's happening for you this week in Podland, Sam?
Well, my youngest daughter turns 18 today, so yes, that ages me very much. Thank you very much for doing that to me, but congratulations to my youngest daughter. And to age me further,
yes.
Not only are we having a marquee in the garden and all the paraphernalia that goes with it, but it's coming along with 80 teenagers as well, so God help me.
Wow, that's going to be fun. 80 teenagers.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't fancy your loo after that.
No. Actually, James, totally agreed with you. So we've got portaloos for them. They're not coming in the house. Yep.
Wow.
No, not coming in the house.
This is how the other half live. You're not coming in the house. We've rented some special loos just for you.
Exactly.
Wowee. Well, that's going to be fun. And this is happening, what, today?
No, her birthday's today, as we record on Thursday, and on Saturday we have the influx of 17 and 18-year-olds coming to the house. So, but they're going in the garden, they're staying in the garden, they're never coming near the house. That's fine. Anyway, James, I'll let you know if I've recovered by next week. Now, what's happening for you in Podland this week?
Well, good luck. So in Podland this week, I've been recovering from Dallas because, my goodness, that's a lot of hard work, podcast movement. And what I'm doing is I'm just getting ready to fly off to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which is where I'll be at the beginning of next week for Radio Days Asia, which should be good fun. Looking forward to that. That should be that should be a good thing. And a few other things, irons in the fire, and so on. And yes, that's it for this week. If you like this episode of Podland, please tell others to visit. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another review and analysis of all things podcasting.
You'll also find all our previous shows and interviews on our website, podland.news. You can give us feedback using a Boostgram, and if your podcast app doesn't support Boost, then as we say, grab a new app from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Yes, if you want daily news, you should get Pod News. The newsletter's free at podnews.net. The podcast can be found in your podcast app, and all of the stories that we've discussed on Podland today are in the show notes. We use chapters and transcripts too.
Our music is from Studio Dragonfly.
It is Studio Dragonfly, which is a brand new name for the previous name that we used to mention before. They were due to be at Podcast Movement, Studio Dragonfly, but they ended ended up, at least one of them, Chris, ended up flying all the way to Dallas and then spent an entire week in isolation in his Airbnb, which is no good at all. But just a note to thank Studio Dragonfly for the music that we use every single week. And you should check out their website. They've got a ton of music which is available for podcasts, both little effects, but also full music and albums as well. It's at studiodragonfly.com, I think. Should probably check that, shouldn't I? studiodragonfly.com. I was correct. So worthwhile going over there and supporting them.
We are hosted and sponsored by our good friends Buzzsprout and Squadcast.
We are indeed. Thanks to them, and keep listening.